morning in the conference room on the 42nd floor. Cold lights reflecting off the glass table. CEO Clara Voss, in a powerful white dress, pointed at the employee cleaning spilled coffee cups. "Who let you into the executive meeting?" "I'm just cleaning, ma'am." "Good. Then just do that job. Failures don't belong here." The whole room laughed. The man bowed his head, sleeves rolled up, revealing a small tattoo, wings and the number F22309. The air froze. A voice rang out from the corner. It was the corporation chairman. "Stand at attention." He was a United States Air Force captain pilot. Everyone held their breath. The CEO's face went pale. Ethan Ward, 39 years old, single father, former F-22 pilot, left the military after a training accident, now worked as maintenance staff in Vostek Aviation Corporation. Clara Voss, 33 years old, cold CEO, smart but arrogant, believed only winners deserve to be remembered. Lily Ward, 8 years old, Ethan's daughter, dreamed of becoming an aviation engineer like her father. Ethan worked quietly in the technical floor, always arrived early, always helped others, never complained. Everyone called him the floor cleaner who calculates like an engineer. He never revealed his past. After his wife died from illness, he moved to a small city, applied for work at his old corporation, just to be near where he once designed the first F-22 model. He believed working with integrity doesn't require a title. Meanwhile, Clara, the new CEO, was developing commercial aircraft based on military technology, but always looked down on subordinates. In a strategy meeting, she said, "Floor cleaners don't understand the sky." Ethan heard, just smiled. One day, he fixed the coffee machine in the meeting room, accidentally met her. "You do technical work?" "Used to." "Where?" "In the air." "Oh, a pilot or an unfinished dream?" "Both," she laughed coldly. "That's why I'm in this chair, and you're mopping floors." He didn't answer, just said softly, "Your seat is high, but who keeps it clean matters more." Ethan's story was more complicated than anyone knew. 10 years ago, he'd been one of the Air Force's brightest. Top Gun graduate, test pilot, the kind of career trajectory that led to generalships. He'd loved flying more than anything except his wife Sarah and baby Lily. Then came the accident. Not his fault. Equipment failure during a high-altitude test. He'd ejected, survived, but 3 other pilots hadn't. The investigation cleared him, but the guilt didn't. Sarah had begged him to quit. "You have a daughter. She needs her father alive." He'd resisted, insisted flying was who he was. Then Sarah got sick, cancer, aggressive, terminal. The military had been generous with leave, but there were limits. He'd had to choose, his career or his wife's final months. He'd chosen Sarah, held her hand through chemo, read to her when she was too weak to hold a book, been there when she died, whispering that she loved him and Lily would be okay. After the funeral, he'd resigned his commission, couldn't face the cockpit without thinking about what he'd lost. Both the pilots who died and the woman who'd saved him from becoming just another adrenaline junkie in a flight suit. He'd moved back to his hometown, needed something simple. Vostek had been hiring maintenance staff. He'd applied, been vastly overqualified, but they'd needed someone who understood aircraft systems. They'd hired him without knowing his background. He'd never corrected them. The work was meditative. Cleaning, repairing, maintaining. He could do it without thinking, which meant he could think about other things. About Lily's homework, about what to make for dinner, about whether Sarah would be proud of the father he'd become. He wasn't ashamed of janitorial work. Honest labor was honest labor. But he also wasn't advertising his past. People treated him differently when they knew, either with false respect or with pity. He preferred being invisible. Clara Voss had been different since she'd taken over as CEO 2 years ago. Young, brilliant, ruthless. She doubled profits, streamlined operations, made Vostek a leader in commercial aviation. But she'd done it by treating people as resources, not humans. High turnover, brutal hours, zero tolerance for weakness. Ethan had watched good people quit or burn out, had stayed because he needed the insurance for Lily and because someone had to maintain the aircraft properly. Safety didn't care about profit margins. Their first interaction had been brief. She'd been touring the facility, he'd been cleaning a hallway. She'd walked past without acknowledging him. Standard behavior from executives. But then she'd stopped, turned back. "You? Is this floor supposed to be this clean?" "Yes, ma'am." "It's cleaner than my office." "That's the idea, ma'am." She'd studied him. "You're very thorough for maintenance." "I believe in doing things right." "Admirable. Keep it up." She'd walked away and Ethan had thought that would be the end of it. But she'd noticed him after that. Started making comments. Nothing overtly cruel, just dismissive. "The cleaning crew is here. Make sure the janitor doesn't interrupt." Small put-downs that established hierarchy. Ethan never reacted. He'd faced enemy aircraft and hostile fire. A CEO's ego wasn't remotely threatening, but he noticed how her words affected others. Maintenance staff keeping their heads down, engineers afraid to speak up, a culture of fear disguised as excellence. The coffee machine incident had been typical. She'd implied he was a dreamer who'd failed. He'd suggested that height without foundation was precarious. She'd taken it as insubordination. He'd meant it as truth. The gap between them wasn't just professional. It was philosophical. She believed in climbing. He believed in building. Neither was wrong, but they were incompatible. An employee recalled, "He never argued back, just mopped and smiled. The CEO thought she won, but everyone knew he had something very different." Voss Tech was preparing to launch a new aircraft model worth $3 billion. But during testing, the main engine reported an error. Ethan heard the news, quietly checked the old design, discovered a small assembly error. If not fixed, the plane could explode during test flight. He brought documents to the CEO's office. "Ms. Hayes, I think there's a mistake in the stability system." "Who do you think you are to teach me?" "Just someone who doesn't want to see an accident." "Please leave my office, just mop floors, don't teach flying." He placed the blueprint on the desk. "I used to fly F-22s. I know the sound of an engine about to explode." She laughed mockingly. "Enough, Mr. Ward. If you were really a pilot, you wouldn't be here." The whole meeting room burst out laughing. He just nodded lightly, turned away. But that evening, he anonymously sent the error report to the Aviation Safety Board. The next morning, auditors unexpectedly arrived to inspect, right at the grand meeting Clara organized before the media. When Ethan entered to clean the table, she said coldly, "Get out immediately. People like you tarnish the company's image." "Are you sure image is what needs cleaning most here?" She laughed contemptuously. "You're good at talking truth." "No, I'm good at living truth." The error Ethan had discovered was serious. The stability system had been redesigned to save weight, improve fuel efficiency. Good intentions, but the engineering team had missed something critical. Under specific stress conditions, the mounting brackets would fail, not immediately but gradually. By the time pilots noticed, it would be too late. The plane would enter an uncontrollable spin. Everyone aboard would die. Ethan had seen it immediately. Years of test piloting had given him instincts others lacked. He could look at a design and feel where the weakness was. This design screamed danger. But Clara hadn't wanted to hear it. Admitting an error meant delays. Delays meant losing the market advantage. She'd bet everything on this launch. Her reputation, her position, her ego. An anonymous janitor telling her she was wrong? Unacceptable. So Ethan had gone around her. The Aviation Safety Board took anonymous tips seriously. Too many disasters had been caused by ignored warnings. They'd sent inspectors immediately, unannounced. Clara had been furious. Someone had sabotaged her launch. Someone would pay. The grand meeting she'd planned with media and investors became an embarrassing scramble to explain why safety inspectors were crawling over their prototype. When Ethan had entered to clean, it had been terrible timing. Clara had been on edge, humiliated, looking for someone to blame. And there he was, the janitor who dared question her. She'd lashed out, made him the scapegoat in front of everyone. "People like you tarnish the company's image." The insult had been meant to remind everyone of their place. She was CEO. He was nothing. Except her words had the opposite effect. Because when Ethan had responded about what needed cleaning, everyone knew what he meant. The image problem wasn't him. It was leadership that valued appearance over safety, profit over people, pride over prudence. His calm response had been devastating precisely because it was true, and everyone in that room knew it. The maintenance staff knew, the engineers knew, even Clara knew, though she'd never admit it. The tension in the room had been thick. Clara had expected humiliation would make Ethan back down. Instead, he'd held his ground with quiet dignity. Hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been disrespectful, but also hadn't retreated. "I'm good at living truth." That single line had resonated, because everyone there knew they were living something else. Living for quarterly results, for bonuses, for promotions. Living in fear of the next evaluation, the next cut, the next impossible demand. The auditors had found the error exactly where Ethan's report said it would be. Had grounded the aircraft pending redesign. Clara had been forced to make a public statement about proactive safety measures and commitment to excellence. Behind closed doors, she'd raged. Demanded to know who'd filed the report. Security couldn't trace it. Ethan had covered his tracks well, but Clara had suspected. The way he'd looked at her when mentioning exploding engines, he'd known. That evening, Ethan had gone home to Lily, made dinner, helped with homework, told her about his day in vague terms. Work was interesting. "Did you help people, Daddy?" "I tried to, sweetheart." "Then it was a good day." Her simple moral framework kept him grounded. Lily saw the world in clear terms. Helping was good. Hurting was bad. Everything else was details. If only corporate leadership was that straightforward, he'd known there would be consequences. Clara wasn't the type to forget or forgive. She'd find a way to punish him eventually. But Ethan had made peace with that risk. Because $3 billion and hundreds of future passengers were worth his job. If he was fired for doing the right thing, so be it. He'd find other work. But he'd sleep at night knowing he'd tried to prevent disaster. That was worth more than any paycheck. What he hadn't expected was what would happen next. The chairman getting involved. The truth coming out. His past being revealed. He'd kept it buried for so long. Had built a quiet life separate from his history. Now that separation was about to collapse. And he wasn't sure he was ready. A PR employee recalled, when he walked out, she was still laughing, but his eyes made the whole room go silent. The inspection began. Before the media, Clara introduced the new aircraft model, Eagle 1. When the safety team asked about the engine, she confidently said, "All specifications have been approved." Suddenly, a young engineer trembled. "Ma'am, Blueprint 4A has changes from an anonymous source, and it saved the engine from exploding." Anonymous? Someone who signed F-22-309. She startled, recognizing the familiar code, exactly the number engraved on the janitor's tattoo. The door opened. Ethan entered with his mop, still in his old uniform. All cameras turned toward him. Clara shouted, "How dare you falsify company records?" The chairman interrupted. "Be quiet, Clara. This man doesn't need to fake anything. He was the captain of the F-22 test squadron." The whole room froze. That tattoo isn't a game. It's the title of the man who saved 19 pilots in a test explosion. She trembled. "You are someone who once flew for the sky you're making money from. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because people who once flew high don't need to show off their wings. They just need to keep them clean." The whole room stood up, silent, bowing their heads. An engineer said quietly, "Thank you, Colonel Ward." He only replied, "I'm no longer Colonel. Now I'm just a father who mops floors." She burst into tears. He said gently, "It's okay. Cleaning the wrong place can still be cleaned again." The revelation had hit like a bomb. The chairman, Richard Sterling, was old guard military. He'd flown combat missions in Desert Storm, knew everyone in the aviation community. When he'd seen the F-22-309 signature on the anonymous report, he'd pulled records, found Ethan Ward, former captain, test pilot, decorated veteran, the man who'd stayed with a damaged aircraft to guide it away from a populated area before ejecting, the man who'd saved an entire squadron during a failed test by diagnosing a systemic flaw no one else had caught. Sterling had been appalled to learn that man was working as a janitor, more appalled to learn how Clara had treated him. He'd watched the security footage from the meeting, seen her belittle and dismiss Ethan, had decided enough was enough. Vostech had been built by engineers and pilots who respected competence over credentials. Clara had forgotten that. She needed to be reminded. So Sterling had arranged this confrontation. Public, undeniable, humbling. When Ethan walked in, he'd known something was wrong. Too many cameras, too much tension. Clara's face had been triumphant, like she'd finally get to punish whoever had embarrassed her. Then Sterling had spoken, and everything changed. Ethan had wanted to disappear. Hadn't wanted this attention, this exposure. His past was his past. He'd left it behind intentionally. But Sterling wasn't giving him a choice. Captain Ward served with distinction for 15 years. 3 tours overseas, countless test flights. He's personally responsible for safety improvements that have saved hundreds of lives. And Clara, you've been treating him like trash. The words hung heavy. Media was filming everything. This would be everywhere within hours. Clara's face had gone from triumphant to horrified to something else. Shame, maybe, or just fear of consequences. I didn't know, she'd protested weakly. You didn't ask, Sterling had replied coldly. You saw a janitor and assumed that was all he was. That's your failure, not his. He'd turned to Ethan. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ethan had considered his words carefully. Because what I was doesn't matter. What I do now is what matters. And what I do now is keep this facility safe. My past doesn't change that. Your past is why you're qualified to keep it safe. No, sir. My present is why I'm qualified. I show up every day. I check systems. I care about the work. That's what qualifies me, not the wings I used to wear. Sterling had looked frustrated, but also impressed. You're stubborn. Yes, sir. Always have been. The room had relaxed slightly. Some people laughed. The tension broke. Clara had been standing frozen, mascara running, struggling to process. This man she'd humiliated repeatedly was a decorated veteran. This janitor she'd dismissed was more accomplished than she'd ever be. The cognitive dissonance was destroying her carefully constructed worldview. I'm sorry, she'd finally managed. I was wrong. About everything. Ethan had looked at her, really looked, and seen not an enemy, but a person drowning in her own inadequacy. It's okay, he'd said simply. You didn't know. Now you do. What matters is what you do next. I don't know what to do. Start by listening to everyone, not just people who look like they belong in an executive suite. The people doing the actual work know things. Respect that. She'd nodded, tears still falling. I'll try. That's all anyone can ask. The media had eaten it up. Humble janitor revealed as war hero. CEO humiliated by man she mocked. The wings under the uniform. Ethan had hated every headline. He'd gone home that night, hugged Lily extra tight. Are you famous now, Daddy? I hope not, sweetheart. But they said you were a hero. I was just a pilot who did his job, same as I do now. But it's cooler now. He'd laughed despite himself. Maybe a little. The response from the aviation community had been overwhelming. Former colleagues reaching out. Current pilots thanking him for the safety report. Parents of the 19 pilots he'd saved sending messages. He'd saved their children, and they'd never been able to thank him because the incident had been classified. Now they could. Now they knew he was alive, still working, still saving lives in his quiet way. Clara had been notably absent from the media circus. She'd released a statement apologizing, promising reforms, but hadn't done interviews. Ethan had respected that. She was processing, rethinking everything. That took time. Humiliation was a powerful teacher, but a slow one. A week after the revelation, she'd called him to her office. He'd gone expecting another confrontation. Instead, he'd found her behind her desk, looking small and tired. I fired everyone who laughed, she'd said without preamble. Don't, Ethan had replied. They were following your lead. You set the tone. They just echoed it. So it's my fault. Leadership always is, but firing them doesn't fix the culture. Teaching them does. She'd looked at him with something like wonder. "How are you not angry? I treated you terribly." "I'm a little angry, but mostly I'm just tired, and anger doesn't clean anything, so I'd rather fix what's broken." An employee recalled, "He wasn't angry, just picked up the handkerchief the CEO dropped, handed it back, then said, 'Don't spill again.'" The whole room went silent as paper. 1 month later, Clara organized an aviation safety honor ceremony, invited Ethan to the stage. "I once looked down on him because I thought I was higher, but now I know the people who really keep us safe are the ones we never see." Ethan only said, "I don't need honors, just need leaders who dare to bow when wrong." She bowed her head genuinely. After the ceremony, she went to see him in the maintenance workshop. "I fired everyone who laughed that day." He smiled softly. "Don't fire them. Teach them." She looked at him, voice choking. "You're still kind, though I insulted you." "Because I understand. People who mock are often just hiding their own fears." The ceremony had been Clara's idea, a public acknowledgement that safety mattered more than profit, that expertise existed at all levels, that everyone deserved respect. She'd invited regulators, media, employees, made it a whole thing. Ethan had been reluctant, but Lily had begged him to go. "Please, Daddy, I want to see you get an award." So he'd put on his one good suit, let his daughter fix his tie, and gone. The auditorium had been packed. Clara's speech had been surprisingly personal. She'd talked about her own arrogance, her mistakes, the lessons she'd learned. "I was so focused on being respected that I forgot to be respectable. This man showed me the difference. He didn't demand respect. He earned it through competence, integrity, and humility. Those are the qualities that matter, not titles, not corner offices, not expensive suits, character." When Ethan had gone to the stage, the standing ovation had been thunderous. He'd stood there uncomfortable with the attention, waiting for it to end. When it finally did, he'd spoken briefly. "I appreciate this, but I need to be clear. I didn't fix that engine design to be a hero. I did it because it was my job. Safety is everyone's job, from the CEO to the janitor. We're all responsible for each other. That's what makes a company work. Mutual responsibility and respect." He'd paused, looked directly at Clara. "Ms. Voss made mistakes. She's admitted that publicly, which takes courage. But the real question isn't whether she made mistakes. It's whether she learns from them. I believe she will. And when she does, this company will be better for it." More applause. Clara had been crying openly, not caring how it looked. After she'd sought him out. "Why did you defend me? After everything?" "Because shame doesn't teach, support does. You're trying to change. I want to help that succeed. I don't deserve your kindness. None of us deserve the grace we receive, but we can choose to extend it anyway. That's how we become better." They'd talked for over an hour. About leadership, about culture, about the difference between fear and respect. Clara had been a sponge, absorbing everything, asking questions, genuinely trying to understand. The changes had started small. Clara now spent 1 hour a day on the facility floor, talking to workers, learning about their jobs, asking for input. She'd implemented a suggestion program where anyone could submit safety concerns anonymously. She'd changed performance evaluations to include collaboration and respect metrics, not just results. She'd started attending maintenance briefings, learning the systems from the ground up. The culture shift had been slow but real. People started speaking up. Engineers challenged bad ideas. Maintenance staff reported concerns without fear. The company became less efficient in the short term, but safer and more innovative long term. Morale improved. Turnover decreased. And Clara's leadership style evolved from dictatorial to collaborative. She was still demanding, but no longer cruel. Still ambitious, but no longer ruthless. Ethan watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He'd never wanted to be a teacher, but that's what he'd become. And Clara was a dedicated student. She'd ask his opinion on decisions, run ideas past him, seek feedback. It was odd being consulted by someone who'd once dismissed him, but it was also gratifying. Change was possible. People could grow. And sometimes the most unlikely people became the best students. From today, I choose to look at each other a little longer. I will live with kindness, 1 year later, the company launched Project Falcon 309, inspired by the number on his arm. Clara asked his permission to engrave that number on the fuselage of the first model aircraft. At the ceremony, she said, "Sometimes real wings aren't on shoulders, they're in hearts." Ethan looked at the seats below where Lily sat, hand raised high, holding a drawing. "Dad doesn't mop floors, Dad cleans the sky." He burst out laughing, tears falling. When the CEO stepped down from the stage, she whispered, "Thank you for letting me learn to fly." He replied, "No, I just taught you how to land safely." Project Falcon 309 had been Clara's brainchild, a new commercial aircraft built on principles of safety first. Every decision vetted by multiple teams, every concern addressed. Input solicited from everyone, from designers to maintenance crew. It was slower, more expensive, but the result was the safest commercial aircraft ever designed. And it bore Ethan's number as tribute, not to him specifically, but to everyone who worked in the shadows keeping others safe. The unveiling had been emotional. Clara had given a speech about how pride had nearly destroyed everything. How one man's courage had saved not just an aircraft, but a company's soul. How the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. Ethan had watched from backstage, Lily beside him, holding the drawing she'd made. "Is that for me?" "No, Daddy, it's for everyone, so they remember." When Clara had invited them on stage, shown Lily's drawing to the crowd, explained what it meant, there hadn't been a dry eye in the house, a child's simple truth cutting through all the corporate complexity. Dad doesn't mop floors, Dad cleans the sky, because safety work was just another form of flying, keeping people airborne, keeping them safe, keeping them alive. That was the real job. Everything else was just details. After the ceremony, Clara had found them in a quiet corner. "Thank you for this past year, for teaching me, for being patient with me, for not giving up when I was insufferable." "You were never insufferable, just learning." "I was definitely insufferable." They'd laughed. "Maybe a little," Ethan had conceded, "but you got better." "I'm trying to, every day. That's all anyone can do." She'd knelt to Lily's level. "Thank you for the drawing. It's perfect." "You're welcome. Are you going to be nicer to Daddy now?" "I'm going to try very hard to be nicer to everyone." "Good, because Daddy says being mean just makes you small." Clara had glanced at Ethan. "Your dad is very wise." "I know," Lily had said proudly. The next morning, Ethan had arrived at work to find his maintenance station transformed. New tools, better equipment, a proper office space. And on the wall, Lily's drawing, framed professionally. Clara had left a note. "You've been cleaning our sky for a year. Let us return the favor. With gratitude, Clara." He'd stood there, overwhelmed. Not by the gifts, but by what they represented. Change, growth, respect. The things he'd hoped for when he'd sent that anonymous report. He still mopped floors, still fixed things, still showed up early and stayed late. But now people greeted him by name. Asked his opinion, listened when he spoke. The culture had shifted, and he'd been the catalyst. Not because he demanded it, but because he'd embodied it. Respect through competence, leadership through service, dignity through humility. The lessons his father had taught him, the lessons the Air Force had reinforced, the lessons he'd tried to teach Lily. Now they were lessons for an entire company. An employee recalled, "Now every morning she touches the F-22 model before working, and he still mops floors, but everyone stands to greet him." If you believe healing stories like this deserve to be told and not forgotten, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that should never be forgotten.